Greetings everyone, how's it going? Now as promised, I'll show you how to overclock AMD's Ryzen 7 2700X to something like 4.2 GHz, which more or less seems to be achievable with almost every 2700X there is out there. Now initially I also wanted to do some overclocking with the included stock cooler, the Wraith Prism, but it already led to pretty high temperatures at stock settings, so hardly any headroom for overclocking left. That's why I went straight for a decent 240mm AIO liquid cooler. Now how much more performance do 4.2 GHz get us with this CPU? After all, the 2700X already does clock pretty damn high thanks to AMD's new aggressive XFR2 and Precision Boost 2. Is manual overclocking even worth it here? Right away, I probably should point out, if you didn't already know, you need an overclocking compatible motherboard, so one of those new chipsets like B450 or X470 will do, but if you happen to have a B350 or X370 board, as long as you have the latest BIOS on there, you should be totally fine too. I'll be using this MSI X470 Gaming Pro Carbon and will install my trusty G-Skill Flare X 3200 MHz memory. Also, I should point out that overclocking pretty much is all about silicon lottery. One CPU may overclock like crazy and not require a whole lot of voltage to maintain a high clock speed. Others hardly will hit anything higher than 4.1 GHz. And guess what? This is the second time I've ever won this silicon lottery. I managed to get my 4.2 GHz rock solid stable with an exceptionally low CPU core voltage. Okay, so now let's get started. What I tend to do first is fire up CPU-Z and check my CPU voltage at stock settings. Next up, you could use AMD's Ryzen Master tool to get the overclocking job done, but I don't like overclocking within the OS, so that's why I boot into the BIOS and start dialing in my desired CPU ratio, which is 42 in this case. Then as for the RAM, make sure it's running at its rated frequency. Do so by enabling AXMP, DOCP, or whatever it's called like in your BIOS. My memory is set to run at 3200 MHz with the correct timings. Unfortunately, this board doesn't allow for offset overclocking, so I need to set the voltage the traditional way. I found my CPU to be perfectly stable at 1.3125 volts. But your chip might crash, but it's a good starting point. From there, just work your way up until it's 100% stable. I didn't need to adjust any load line calibration settings whatsoever. I left it all on default for this simple overclock. I didn't even need to touch the SoC voltage. In my case, according to CPU-Z, my 2700X is running at 1.328 volts, which as opposed to stock settings is a pretty minimal voltage increase. I do have a damn good chip here for sure. Usually you'll need like 1.35 to 1.39 volts or even more, but I honestly wouldn't bother going over the 1.4 volt mark. Not worth it, you'll find out why in the benchmarks now. As we've clearly seen, yes, we do see some improvements overall here and there, but those are very minimal actually, something you wouldn't really notice. Neither in games Cinebench nor in Vegas Pro 15 do we see a noteworthy improvement over stock speeds, especially not when factoring in the higher power consumption, especially on idle. And keep in mind, I was lucky I hardly needed to apply any more voltage. So if you, let's say, cannot get your chip stable at 1.328 volts, you may need something like 1.35 or 1.39. This will greatly increase your power consumption for very little performance gain. And then, unlike in my case, you'll have to factor in the drastically higher temperature as well. Now the question may arise, why is there so little performance gain when manually overclocking this 2700X? Well, I'm blaming this on XFR2 and Precision Boost 2. Those apparently do a phenomenal job at maintaining high clock speeds without us even needing to touch any overclocking settings whatsoever. And it kinda seems to me the Ryzen 7 2700X tops out at 4 GHz performance-wise. Anything above hardly does contribute to performance gains. However, I've heard 2nd gen Ryzen benefits from even faster RAM rather than manual overclocking. Unfortunately, I don't have any high-frequency memory at hand to try that out. So the bottom line here is, in my opinion, the 2700X is not a super good overclocker, and there's no need to tinker with the clock speeds. I think it's best to leave everything at stock settings with this 2700X, since XFR2 and PB2 do an incredibly good job already getting the most out of your CPU for a nice balance between clock speeds, temperature and power draw. And with that said, thanks for watching.